Hi, I'm Arati. Whenever we go away for a few days, I take along with me a little art kit. This time I have with me a Posca marker. This is the new white brush tip. I like the pointiness of it and it's really nice and opaque. And then I've got a fude nib fountain pen, a color pencil, a travel brush, and an extra pen just in case my fountain pen runs out. Let's start with the travel brush. This is a Tintoretto squirrel hair brush in number 6. It's really beautifully balanced and it folds out into a full-sized brush, which is really nice to use when I'm out about, and a very nice pointy tip, which I will show you how to use. The second thing I have is a Luminance pencil in Payne's Grey, one of my absolute favorite colors. And then the Fudenosuke pen is just in case I run out of ink in my fude nib pen. I'm not really intending to use this, but it has a flexible nib that I can simulate a fude nib pen with. Finally, this is my Duke fude nib pen. It's a new acquisition since I did my fountain pen video, which if you haven't watched that yet, I'll link that for you down in the description box below. It has a bent nib and provides very nice varied lines. Then I've got the Pith sketchbook with a Jackson's bandolier on it in order to hold my pencils. You can use it sideways like I was, or vertically as well. You can pop a couple of pencils in the elastic. The Pith sketchbook is the little Kabosu one that I've used for my travel sketches for the past year and more, I think. It's a bit grimy, but it does the job. Then I've got a juice bottle with some water, and this little bag holds a couple of things. Firstly, it's got the Tagal sharpener, which is one of my favorites, primarily for the variety of sharpening that I can do. I've got a magnetic clip, and I've got my Roman Szmal watercolor kit. This is the mini urban kit with a few extra colors that I have reviewed on my channel before. I have been using this quite a lot lately because it's really tiny. It fits in my pocket, and particularly in combination with this magnetic clip, I can pretty much take it anywhere and it won't really fall or do anything unwarranted. So let's open up a fresh page in this sketchbook, and I will be drawing for approximately 25 minutes to half an hour, and I'll take you along for the ride in real time. Some of you have asked me if I would show my actual painting process instead of just little clips in my other videos, so here you go. I started out drawing this with a pencil with the intention of drawing it just as a study. But as you will see a little bit later, I did change my mind about what I was going to do. And sometimes this happens because you start drawing a scene and then you think, maybe I could do this in a different way. It just doesn't have to be a straight up study every single time. So as you can see here, I started drawing a line across for the window that I was looking through. But then I figured that I would just draw the window as the major focus with the tree behind it. So you can still see the tree behind, but I'm actually drawing in darker lines for the window itself and including some details like the latch and some of the surrounds of the window, like the wall and the blind over it, as you'll see a little bit later in the video. I did color in the entire window, and this took quite a while, but I had nothing else to do, and it was just really nice and kind of mindful and peaceful to sit there coloring this in. I made sure to color with the grain of the wood so that it gave it a little bit of variation. So the horizontal lines were colored horizontally with the pencil moving from side to side, and then the vertical lines, as I'm doing here, vertically from top to bottom. It just gave it a little bit more of a realistic feel, which I wasn't really going for, but that's kind of it. I also used the side of the pencil to get variations in tone, just so that the values were correct, because the wall was very much lighter than the window frame was, so I didn't want it to all look really flat. I also did some patterns in the little bit of the blind that was visible above the window. It's just framing the tree that I'm eventually going to do in full color, as opposed to the window that's just in grays. It just makes it a little bit more of an interesting composition, in my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. In retrospect, I feel like maybe I added a little too much detail for the blind, but then it's a sketchbook, so it doesn't really matter if I go wrong. It's just a lesson for next time that I draw. And I can look back at this and think, okay, these are the things I liked and these are the things I didn't, and then either improve upon them or try and improve upon the mistakes in order to make them into something that looks good. After I'd colored all this in, I took my clip and popped it on my sketchbook. Now, I never really clip the page that I'm working on. I always clip the pages underneath. And there you can see a little sketch of my niece playing rugby that I suppose I'll finish at some point. And then I pop my watercolor palette on top, and I prop the page open with that watercolor palette. So I don't have any clips holding any space down, so I can color wherever I want. And here is how the palette and clip work. Really, really stable. It's a really solid magnetic clip. Because I was sitting on a bed, it was a little bit iffy setting up my water and everything. I was really careful to make sure that I didn't drop anything anywhere, since we were staying in a shepherd's hut overnight, and obviously I didn't want to stain their bedding or anything, in which case it's really easy to bring watercolors along because they're really easy to wash out if you do happen to get anything on anything that's not yours, which fortunately did not happen for me. So here I am setting up my brush. As you can see, it's really easy to do one-handed. I didn't bring a tripod with me on this trip because I didn't really expect to have time to film a video. So it's nice to know that I can use this brush and the entire watercolor setup with just one hand as well. I just wet some of my watercolors to make sure they were nice and liquidy when I did come to use them. And you can see my slightly precarious balancing of the water. I did also forget to bring my little wristband that I usually wipe my brush on, so I got some loo roll and used that instead. I did make sure to put that little bag that I had everything in underneath the loo roll so that when it got wet, it wouldn't seep through onto the bed. Definitely important to make sure you don't do that. Anyway, I started by using the autumn green. This is the Roman Szmal autumn green that came with the Urban SKetchers set. And here you can see the view that I'm actually drawing. If you take a screenshot and draw, please do share with me. I'd love to see what you made. I started off with the Roman Szmal autumn green to do sort of the fields behind the tree that I was drawing. I didn't really intend to put much detail in there, so I was very rough with it. And because the pith paper is kind of like hot press watercolor paper, well, not quite, but it behaves kind of like hot press watercolor paper. The watercolor tends to sort of pool on the top of the paper rather than being absorbed quite as easily as cold press seems to. But I like that. I like that it creates texture and it creates more dark areas and some light areas and things like that. And it doesn't flow quite as smoothly as traditional watercolor paper perhaps would. I suppose purists would say that this is not the way to use watercolor. But in my opinion, there's no right or wrong way to use any art supply. They should be used as you choose to use them to express what you want to express. And the only wrong way to use a watercolor, as I've said before, is not to use them at all. Use what you have. Cheap, expensive, doesn't matter. As long as you use them, as long as you're creating the art that you want to create, whether it's to show people or not show people or keep in your cupboard or whatever. Anyway, as I've been waffling on about that, I have filled in the bottom two panes and I'm adding just a little bit to the top based on what I can see out of the window. I'm not really adding the sky. Lately, I've not been painting the sky in. I feel like it looks nice, the color of my sketchbook page. Not quite sure why I started doing that. I think I started doing that during my Peachtober drawings and then I've just continued that. So the next thing I'm doing is adding a little bit of shadow violet and French ultramarine to give a little bit of depth to that autumn green. The green is really very bright, and obviously watercolors dry lighter than they look when they are wet, so you do have to take that into account when you're painting with these. But it just adds a little bit more variation, especially when it dries as it does on hot press paper. It'll give a little bit more depth. And I also mixed some of the ultramarine with the autumn green in order to create the tree itself. While the section hasn't dried yet, I don't really mind that it's going to mix when I come down to it. I really want it to mix and look a little bit more cohesive before I add brown shades on top. I'm drawing the tree, but I'm also choosing which branches to draw because I can't put everything in. Sometimes that's the problem with a scene like this. There's a lot of detail, but you have to choose what you put in and what you leave out. So I choose to put in the bits that interest me, the stuff that caught my eye in the first place when I was walking up to the shepherd's hut and I actually saw the tree and I was like, ooh, what a lovely tree. So I can see there's a fence behind and bushes and a field, and I think there were horses in the field as I recall. But I'm not choosing to draw any of that. I'm just choosing to concentrate on the tree because that was what caught my eye. I suppose it's kind of like editing what you see. When you take a photograph, it automatically photographs everything. But when you look at that photograph, your eye only sees what you're interested in or what the composition has focused on. So if the tree is in the foreground, your eye is going to focus on that tree, not everything else that is also in the picture, right? Unless you look a little bit more closely. But the sketch, the whole point of this is what I'm saying is that the sketch is focusing on what I saw immediately, and that's intentional. Coming back to what I'm actually doing here, I'm just getting the basic shape of the tree so that the variation in color will happen as the paint dries. And I will come back over this in a little bit to get the definition for the tree, because obviously the tree is not green in color. I mean, I could leave it green, but that's not what I intend to do. I do intend to add some more brown colors to it. But while that is drying, I did focus on doing a little study of the branches of the tree so that when I come to do the brown over the left-hand side page, I have a better understanding of what I'm looking at, of the kind of lines that I should be using or the lines that I could be using, and the textures that I might want to get, and so on and so forth. I'm using a combination of burnt sienna brownish and French ultramarine to get this kind of Van Dyke browny grey kind of color. Greyish, I guess you'd call it greyish. It's one of my favorite ways to do a darker brown. And there are ways to actually do an entire painting with just French ultramarine and burnt sienna brownish. I haven't done a video on that myself, but you could probably just do a YouTube search and find one yourself if you would like to try it. But anyway, what I'm doing here is looking at the tree. I'm not really looking at the page here. I'm looking at the tree and using my brush to kind of get shapes and forms that I can see on the tree. I am using the tip of the brush quite a lot to get thinner strokes, and then the body of the brush to get thicker strokes as well. But I'm looking for the forms that I might use on the left-hand side page. I am understanding how the tree branches are working. I'm looking rather than imagining what I'm drawing. A lot of times I do use my imagination, but that's only because I do studies like this where I'm actually looking so that my brain doesn't make up what it sees. It's actually drawing what it is actually looking at instead of filling in the spaces. So because I do this and train my brain to see what it's actually seeing, later on I can then reference this from my own brain, which is one of the reasons why I don't really use reference pictures anymore, is that I've already got a little bank, a Pinterest in my head, as it were, of images like this so that I understand what I'm drawing, and when I need to, I do use references, and then that also builds up into an image bank in my head. So over time, that bank kind of grows and grows and grows, and that's how you end up drawing from imagination accurately. That left-hand side page is still quite wet, so doing something like this while you're waiting for something else to dry is something that I do quite frequently. Usually I do it in another sketchbook, but this time I literally only packed one sketchbook and the supplies that I showed you earlier. Normally I would have the sketchbook on the side and then I'd have another sketchbook with me that I'd be working in, and I'd interchange between them depending on drying time and things like that. I'm drawing the second branch behind the first branch, slightly lighter, just a little bit more water and dilution of the paint, just because it is a little bit more in the background and I want the things that are in front to be darker and more vibrant than the things in the background. But it's also a bit of a looser branch, so I did want to draw it. At this point, I did have to turn on the overhead lights because it was starting to get a bit dark. I was drawing this while we were waiting between our walk and dinner, so we just had a little bit of time to kill. And the dog and my husband were taking up the entirety of the little love seat in the shepherd's hut, and I had only the bed to sit on. I was using my fude pen now to get the darks of the branches. Not every single branch, but just kind of getting definition for some of them. At this point, my pen was slightly running out of ink, unfortunately, so it was a bit annoying. But I did persevere, and I did stop a couple of times to kind of like rotate the converter a little bit so that I could get ink back up into the feed. But sometimes you have to do that, particularly when you're using waterproof ink in a fountain pen. even though it's meant for fountain pens, it does dry up faster than non-waterproof inks. I'm not quite sure what it is about the coagulant or whatever it is, but yeah, it does dry up a little bit faster. So for example, I don't ink up all my fountain pens at the same time unless I'm using them, because if you ink them and you leave them, the ink dries and then they don't work properly. It was really starting to get dark at this point, but the tree was still visible, so I just kept on going. It was early in the year, so it wasn't even spring yet, which means that sunset is super early. So by like 3:30 in the winter, and then probably around the time we went, I think 4:30 or 5 was sunset. I'm also adding a few little details to the bark of the tree to get that texture that I can see, but because of the materials I'm using, I didn't really add in that much. So I'm adding it with that pen, and I will add a few more highlights later on as well as shadows, just to make it a little bit more of a study rather than a flat drawing. The versatility of the fude nib here is showing where I can do thicker lines for the tree branch in the foreground and thinner lines just by tilting the pen off the tree branch in the background. So it's just tipping my pen over just so that I'm using the tip and not the flat broad nib. Again, I'm actually looking at as much as I can see of that tree in the dusk rather than just doing it from my imagination. So I'm looking while my pen is drawing. I'm not always looking at the page. I'm looking up and looking down, looking up and looking down. And that's really important when you're trying to study something, because your brain does fill in the gaps. And that's, if you watch crime dramas and crime like documentaries and things, that's why witnesses are not reliable, because they think they see something, but their brain has just filled in the gaps. By the way, while editing this video, I've left in all the drawing bits and only cut out the bits where I had to feed the ink by turning the converter to get out any air bubbles where you can see my pen is skipping a little bit. So I just paused, turned the converter a little bit so that there was more ink in the feed, and carried on. I have actually left all the drawing bits in just so you can see exactly how long a sketch like this takes, what my exact process is, which some of you wanted to know. I do have a fair few of my real-time process videos on my Patreon, but the tier in which they're in, the paid tier, is not currently open. I had to pause it because I just didn't have time to do anything. There's like so many things to do and so little time always. But I will be reopening that sometime in May or June. Nothing will change here on YouTube. I'll still be making videos, but some of the videos that are a bit longer and maybe YouTube doesn't really like them very much will probably go on my Patreon, and you'll be able to watch those. I've almost added all the detail that I possibly can here on the study, just adding a few little branches here and there, and then just touching up where it needs it. At this point, you don't really need that much more. I'm just thickening up some lines to bring it forward rather than having just even lineage everywhere. Is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. But anyway, so that's the base of the study is done. And then the left-hand side page was still a bit wet, so I decided to go ahead and add some more dimension to the study. It's not a complete study, but I was planning to go back to it once I'd done a little bit more on the left-hand side page, but that's not how it worked out, so you got to be a little bit flexible. So I mixed a little bit of shadow violet and some of the burnt sienna brownish to create a grayish color, and also a tiny bit of that French ultramarine to add a little bit more coolness, and added that to do some shadows. Again, I'm looking at the branches. I'm not just making up the shadows. I'm looking to see where they are, how they fall, how the light is falling on the branches, because this is something that I would use as a reference later on. I require it to be based on reality, not just something that my brain made up. So again, I'm going slow. I'm looking up, I'm looking down, and then I'm painting. That's why my brushwork is a little bit slower than it was putting down the base colors on the left-hand side, because those will be worked over again and again, whereas with this one, because I'm using a shadow color, I mean, I can lift the watercolor afterwards, but it's just easier to get it right the first time, isn't it? As before, I'm using a slightly lighter color, which basically means more water, slightly more diluted for the branch in the background as opposed to the one in the foreground, because I want the foreground one to stand out a little bit more and for the image to have a little bit more depth. I also think that this sketch perfectly illustrates why I love this Tintoretto brush so much. It's because I can get really fine detail with that tip, with a really light touch, and then get thicker lines, more chunky paint with the body of the brush. I definitely am going to get a size 4. I think I mentioned in my previous video, which if you haven't watched it, it's about me going urban sketching with the London Urban Sketchers in Moorgate. And I did take this brush along with me for that as well. But I really feel that it's one of my favorite brushes now. And I might end up using it even at home, even though it is just a travel brush. Now back onto that left-hand side page, mixing up a little bit more of that grayish color minus the shadow violet this time. So just burnt sienna brownish and the French ultramarine to get like a grayish brown. It's almost like a Van Dyke brown, this color. And then putting that on the tree branches. Now everything is dried, but I'm still leaving some of the green underneath because that just ties it in with the base ground that I've used. I feel like I am using the lessons I learned from doing that study on the right hand side in order to get the branches here, because I only laid down a base for this. I didn't do any like detailed work. So as I'm drawing, again, I'm looking at the tree that I'm drawing, but I'm also referencing the drawing on the right, the study of the branches. So while the one on the right is more of a study, the left-hand side one is more of a sketch. I am partially using my imagination to make it a good composition, but I'm also using my newly acquired knowledge of those tree branches in order to make it more realistic and more like the actual subject I'm drawing. So here's one of those mistakes I was referencing earlier. My watercolor kind of went into the frame of the window, so I'm just using a wet brush to lift off that watercolor. Now this is where it matters what quality of watercolor you're using, because I find that student grade, for example, I've used Cotman watercolors by Winsor & Newton for a long time, and I find that they don't lift as easily as professional grade watercolors do. So for professional grade watercolors, you can get almost back to white, whereas with the Cotman, at least I find that there is still a little bit of color left. Anyway, since I've got that white Posca with me, I can always cover that area over and then paint over it later or draw over it later. I feel like at this point, because I put the green underneath, I'm just adding more dimension to the top half of this tree. I've still left some of that green of the branch visible because I don't know if you can see it in the video, but the tree does have like moss and lichen or lichen, however you want to pronounce it, on it. And I'm also adding those little teeny tiny branches in with the tip of the brush that I didn't add in before because I didn't want them to be green. I wanted those to be brown. I will also add more detail later. You'll just have to wait and see. I always like to use the same color in multiple areas of my picture, which is why I put the green underneath the tree area in the first place, because I feel like it becomes more cohesive. Rather than using 50,000 colors in your painting, just use 2 or 3 well-placed ones all mixed together to create differentiation of tone and a variety of colors. And you'll find that your painting is far more successful than if you have 20 colors in a palette as opposed to just 5. It's also important to understand value, which is the point of the study on the right-hand side page. Understanding where the lights are, where the darks are, how much contrast you need, whether you need a dark next to a light in order to make it stand out or not. I think that's understanding that will really get you where you need to go. Here I'm adding a little bit more burnt sienna brownish and shadow violet in order to get darker areas of the tree, more dimension, a little bit more texture. I'm dabbing just as I did with the study on the right. Again, I'm taking all the stuff I learned from doing that little piece and bringing it into the sketch. I'm also adding more branches with this new brownish color, so it gives it a bit more variation, and then things are in the foreground, some things are in the background. It's just values, again, understanding where the darks and lights need to go. This one is a little bit more, I guess, not exactly from my imagination, but it involves a little bit more creative thinking than the study on the right does, which was a like for like, exactly what I see. Now I'm adding a little bit more dark. I think this has a little bit more ultramarine in it to add the darks to the bottoms of the branches. You can see how this brings even more dimension. The tree looks more three-dimensional than it did before. Adding more and more detail, adding the base of the tree where it hits the window where it should be darker, and adding a little bit more texture to the bark, more shadows to the underside of the branches, and then a few little extra branches here and there just to make it a little bit more interesting. Now, of course, I've done a lot of painting, so this paint is going to have to dry. But there is another thing that I can do while this paint is drying. And then look, I've added a few more branches just because I felt like it needed it, not necessarily that there were branches in that spot. Anyway, so while this paint is drying, I took my Posca pen and tidied up that little bit where the watercolor had leaked over. This kind of pen is really handy for this because you can do wide areas with the side of the brush, but also like fine areas with the tip of it. And then of course, once it dries, I can always draw over that with a pencil. Because the left-hand side page is still drying, I'm back to the right-hand side page, just adding a few little highlights with that Posca brush pen where I can see them. Now by this point it was quite dark, so I really had to squint to see this, but also the lights had come on in the next shepherd's hut, so it was reflecting off the tree a little bit in the same direction as the sun had set, so it was kind of accurate. Once the paint had dried, or well, almost dried, at least the top section had, I took that Payne's Grey pencil, which I'd done the window frame in order to bring, again, a little bit of the color from another part of the painting into the tree. It just makes it a little bit more cohesive, and because it's a pencil, it's adding texture, and it's adding that really dark to the branches of the tree. I am also adding a few extra branches just to get that sort of ethereal feel that some of this tree's branches had. They were just like poking out in little odd spaces. But then again, look, this Pith sketchbook does tend to pill a little bit. So right where my fingers are, you can see that the paint has started to sort of erode the paper a little bit. That fixing that I did with the white Posca is now dry, so I can draw over that with my pencil, and it's like it never happened, almost. At least I know it was there, and on the paper you can see a slight texture. But I'm using that pencil to really get in there with the darks and create that texture and that dimension so that the tree really looks like it's popping out of that green background, but it's still behind the window. You know what I mean? Just like adding shadows and a few more details and branches here and there and so on and so forth. One of the things I really love about drawing something like this on holiday is that every time I look at that sketch, I will remember that moment. I'll remember the murmur of my husband's phone, whatever he was watching, and my dog's sighs as he changed position on the sofa, and just those few little gentle moments between our walk and dinner where we were just sitting and I was drawing and we were just enjoying each other's company without really talking too much, you know? I think that's one of the fun bits of having a little sketchbook like this and taking it around with you. It's full of memories. It's not just full of learning and studies and random sketches. Everything has a meaning. It's not just something you drew for the heck of it. It's something that you drew in a particular moment. I think that's why I've been loving the fude pens lately so much, because they're very immediate. I can take them with me. I don't need too many other art supplies. I can come back and color the image later on. So for example, when I'm going for a walk with my dog Sam, he's often not that patient. So I can sit there and do a pen sketch, but he's not going to wait for me to do 4 layers of watercolor and completely finish off the sketch. So very often I'm going to have to sit there, do the pen sketch, and then remember the colors or take a picture and then come and color it later on back in the studio. And the dog is back in his comfortable bed or in the window nosing at the neighbors. While I managed to finish 3 of the window panes, this 4th window pane I kind of left slightly unfinished because the paper had just pilled and abraded a little too much to go over it with pencil. So you can see here, that's what happens to the pith when you put too much water on it. It just starts to pill and abrade a little bit. So I just went over it lightly and then added details around that section. As I said, it's just a sketchbook, so it's okay. It doesn't really matter. If this had been a final finished piece, I would have started over again, got a fresh piece of paper, and just redone it. And that's the thing, you can redo things. It doesn't have to be perfect the first time. I think we're all a little bit fixated on getting it right the first time because of the immediacy of life these days. You can get stuff delivered the next day, or you can get something to eat out of a can or a ready meal or whatever it is. I think it's just, we need to take a little bit more time. Just do it slowly, relax, take your time, and then you'll end up with something beautiful. I'll show you the other sketch that I did on that trip in a minute. The next morning was very rainy, so we couldn't do a walk as we had expected to, so we just headed home and had a nice pub lunch as well. It was a lovely night away and we hadn't had one for some time, so that was great. And here is the final spread. the fully dry final sketch on the left, and the tree study on the right. That little piece of paper that abraded didn't really make that much difference. It just looks like texture in the tree. I really like the study, and I will be using this in future work as a reference. I also did a sketch the previous day at lunchtime in a pub. There's little Sammy right next to the table, begging for food, as always. And I used the plain Payne's Grey pencil for this. I did like the perspective of this, though it could be improved. The small size of this Pith sketchbook makes it really convenient to take out and about with me. So I have been taking it to things like my niece's swimming lesson, and then out with me on walks with Sam with just a colored pencil, and drawing the canal and birds and just general situations out and about, really. And I also sometimes have prepared pages in it and just work over them with pencil, also on walks with Sam. It's always a really nice challenge to try and use the colors that are in the background to kind of suit the scene that I'm doing as well, because they're just random and done by chance. There are only a few pages left in this sketchbook, so I guess I'll finish it soon and then it will be time for a sketchbook tour. I think you've seen parts of this from my Northumberland video and now from this one as well. One of my little pieces of kit that I forgot to take was this cotton wristband, which I usually wipe my brush on, which is why I was using loo roll in the video. So I normally take paint and then wipe it off like that. So this is something that I should remember to take next time. Anyway, that was my sketch. I hope you enjoyed watching that. Thank you so much, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!